key to our practice along the Buddhist Eightfold Path is what is known as right intention. That is, setting ourselves up and touching base with those intentions that we may have that are most skillful to us and most skillful to those around us. Now, in this discussion, I'll be making background use of this book by Bhante Gunaratana called 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness, where he discusses these elements of the Eightfold Path in a practice-oriented way. I'm not going to be discussing it specifically. However, if you want to read more about it, this is one thing I suggest. I also have a course over on the Online Dharma Institute called the Eightfold Spiral Path, where I get into these matters in more detail. In any event, Bhante Gunaratana discusses this under the description of skillful thinking, which is another way to understand right intention. Now, traditionally, there are said to be 3 aspects to this skillful thinking or right intention. So these 3 aspects are renunciation, non-anger, and harmlessness. Now, we can discuss these in any order, really, but I'll just begin with renunciation, or as Bhante Gunaratana calls it, giving up. Now, this renunciation or giving up is a subtle topic, in particular because there are different ways we can come at the practice, depending on whether we are a monastic or a lay person. I'll assume that most of us here are lay people, but just to get it out of the way, a monastic is going to be renouncing or giving up almost all aspects of ordinary living. That's part of what's involved in the monastic approach to the Dharma and to the path. A lay person, however, is not going to renounce nearly so much, because we have to make a living, we have to support our families, we have other possessions, and so on. And so we're not going to be able to give up quite as much. Now the question might become, how much can we give up? And that is part of our practice. When we discuss practicing right intention, part of our practice, I think, a central part, is to discover for ourselves how much we can give up. What does this kind of skillful renunciation mean for you? And I think it's going to be different for different people, and that is okay. Not all of us are going to be comfortable with giving up as much. And indeed, the Buddha himself, during his day when he discussed these matters with lay audiences, seemed to have been quite aware of this and did not expect his lay audiences to be having the same opinions about what they wish to give up or what they wish to renounce. That said, I can provide some general guidelines and ideas here. One of them is to be more mindful about accumulation, about what we buy, about what we acquire. Do we really need what we're after right now, or can we get by without it? Are we, for example, simply collecting? Now, collecting is we might say, a pastime that a lot of us find enjoyable. It can be fun to get all forms of a particular thing, collect all certain kinds of books, or collect all certain kinds of toys, or watches, or clocks, or whatever it might be in our case. Baseball cards for some people. Beanie Babies it used to be. It kind of scratches the same itch that some of us might have way back in our ancestors may have had for hunting, discovering things at the right price at the right place and so on. However, the problem with collecting is that when we're done, we've got all this stuff to take care of. We've got all this stuff to worry about that's just collecting dust somewhere. So I would recommend that we be mindful and intentional whenever our desires seem to be leading us in the direction of collecting, rather than, say, in a more a more giving up way of understanding acquisition generally. More importantly, perhaps, when it comes to renunciation, is that the flip side of accumulation is generosity. Generosity is one way that we can renounce things, that is by giving them away. Now, in the past I've discussed here how we have what's called a swap shop that's local to us, a place where we can go and leave objects that we no longer need or want, but that are in relatively good condition so that somebody else might take them. That's one way we can be generous and give things away. Other ways, we might If we need the money, we can go to some place like eBay and sell them online, let's say, or there are other places we can sell them, I guess Facebook Marketplace, so on. Or we can find somebody who might need it and give it to them. If we know of somebody, we can put an ad in the paper. I mean, there are many ways we can get rid of things that are useful to other people. Then also we can talk about being generous with money. It's important to be to donate to worthy causes or worthy individuals. And indeed, generosity is a central practice in Buddhism. The Sangha would not exist without the generosity of lay donors. So when the Buddha typically, when he began a Dharma talk to a lay audience, he would begin with an exhortation on the importance of generosity. After all, the monastics depend upon lay donations for their food, for their clothing, for their medicine, for their habitation, their houses. Another central practice of renunciation involves formal meditation itself. Now, formal meditation is of course temporary, but for that time period, it is a quite thorough renunciation of ordinary life. We're no longer paying attention to the things that we ordinarily pay attention to. Instead, we're sitting, perhaps, let's say sitting in noble silence, focusing on the breath. We may be standing, we may be lying down, we may be walking. These are the four standard positions we can take when we're doing formal meditation. For a period of time, focusing and calming the mind. The second aspect of right intention is this intention for non-anger, this awareness that anger is not a skillful mental state and so should be avoided. So awareness of when anger arises. Now, we're not always going to be able to avoid anger because it does arise naturally in all of us. And indeed, as we're practicing, we're probably not even going to be able to always avoid acting out on our anger. And we know that suppressing anger, pretending it doesn't exist or forcing it away, only tends to cause that anger to build up within us. So anger is the sort of state that has to be, I think, acknowledged. We have to be aware of anger when it arises and acknowledge it as anger. And as much as we can, intend not to act upon it. This is our intention and our practice, but of course, it's not something we're going to be perfect at, and we have to be aware of that as well. There are, however, supporting practices that we can use in order to diminish the anger that arises, and in order to perhaps to make it less likely that we'll get angry in the future. And these are collectively known as the Brahma Viharas. I have a video series on them that I'll leave down linked in the notes in case you want to hear more about them. But two that we can discuss in particular are the practices of loving kindness and compassion. I'm not going to go into the practices in any detail here. However, the idea is that we spend time in formal meditation attempting to and intending to cultivate emotions of kindness and emotions of compassion that we can radiate out to the world and to other people around us, and so tend over a period of time to change our outlook on the world from perhaps one that is more anger-based to one that is more kindliness-based. And if we can generate this state, let's say, of compassion, we may be able to extend it out to people that we find difficult and to be compassionate for them. How is that? Well, we can be compassionate because in virtually every case, somebody else who is out there behaving in ways that are unkind or hate-filled tend to be people who are mired in unpleasantness, who are mired in suffering themselves. So if we can see them in that light, as people who, being so filled with hatred, are most likely suffering, it may change the way that we view them, so making us less likely to be angry towards them. Now, indeed, many of you will say that there are people in your lives, or on the news, let's say, that we can't get friendly towards, that we can't feel kindly towards or compassionate towards, that we can't forgive in any real sense, perhaps. That may be the case, but we have to remember these practices are about us, not about them. We don't have any real power to forgive them anyway. What they did is theirs, not ours. The point is to practice for our own purification rather than for the purification of other beings. It will make our own lives happier. So we have to understand that this is not really about them at all. It's rather about ourselves and our own practice. The third aspect of right intention is the intention towards harmlessness, to make the intention not to harm others in our behaviors, in our speech, in our actions. Now, what exactly qualifies as harm? And what might be, let's say, necessary evil in life, things that we have to do that may be unpleasant to others, but just has to get done? And this is indeed part of our practice, is to try to tease this out for ourselves. And I'll discuss this in a bit more detail in future videos where I'll discuss such things as right speech and right action. So there's a lot more to be said about this. I'm not going to get into all of it here. But the point is that discovering what really qualifies as harm is part of what we should be mindful of and try to investigate for ourselves in our own lives. Some examples on a global scale is that we may want to try to minimize the damage that we do to the world through our actions, and similarly make a judicious use of whatever wealth we have in ways that benefit the world. Perhaps we decide, if we have the means and we need a car, that we're going to try to find a car that pollutes less, that has less impact on the environment. Or perhaps we can try to put in solar panels, again, if we have the means to do so. Or if we need to replace some object or something in our house, we look towards heat pump technology, which is much better for the environment. It uses less energy than alternatives. Perhaps we avoid such things as fast fashion in favor of buying clothing that is better made and that will last a longer period of time. All of these are ways that sort of go towards renunciation as well, renouncing things that are harmful, perhaps renouncing the kinds of purchases that are going to be for a shorter period of time in favor of things that last a longer period of time and are better made. Perhaps if we're lucky enough to live in a place that has local farms, perhaps we go to them insofar as we can to buy what we need for our food from local places rather than using some more harmful method of producing food that may be from somewhere farther away. All of this, of course, we have to investigate for ourselves what we feel is best, and there are going to be different decisions made by different people. But we try to avoid, let's say, throwaway culture generally, again, insofar as we can. Always being aware, however, that much of what I've just discussed does involve a large amount of financial privilege. That is to say, these options that I've discussed tend to be more upfront expensive than some of their alternatives, which is why they tend to be less popular. Example, heat pump technology is generally more expensive up front than some of the other options. Buying food from a local farm is going to be more expensive than buying at a less expensive grocery store. So these are all things that we have to understand as being privileges, but if we have the means and ability, perhaps we opt for that. In any event, all of this, and being mindful and intentional about all of it, is indeed part of our practice, essential part of our Buddhist practice. That is to say that we give up what we can, what we don't need. We're generous when we can be generous with things that we don't need. We try to avoid anger and hatred and try to be harmless, try to harm as little as we possibly can. These are all ways that we gain towards right intention. Now, in my next video, I'll be discussing right speech, in a very important part of the path. And when that video is ready, I will leave a link to it up here on the screen. Until then, there'll be another video here that YouTube will present to you, which I hope is of interest. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, any of them, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page, which is also linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.